All right, so yeah, my talk's called Easy, Breezy, Beautiful. It's not cover girl for anyone who did used to watch a lot of America's Next Top Model and had that slogan kind of baked into their brain. But we're talking about testing your UI components using React Testing Library. Before I start talking about that, I figured I'd better introduce myself. My name is Ellie, and my pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I'm a senior product engineer here at Accurx, and I've been working with React for about 5 years now in a few different startups around London. I'm also a dog mum. My dog's out for a walk at the moment, but some of you might have seen her around earlier on or heard her. She's making a bit of a fuss. I like to play D&D, and I like to draw. Today, I really wanted to talk about unit testing because I know it's something that a lot of us can find quite painful. We can find it quite difficult. It can kind of be very boring, like it seems very dull. And sometimes we just dread it so much that we really put it off until the very end of building a feature or building our components. And it can be quite hard to even learn the best practice for it and begin to feel confident about what you're doing with testing. So I definitely used to be that person who used to sort of groan when it was time to write my unit tests. It was just, oh, I felt something fun that I care about. Oh, I guess I better write some tests for it. But I've been lucky enough to have some really great mentors who have basically helped me invest time in learning how to figure out what the best practices are and how to feel confident in the tests I'm writing. And that's given me a lot of confidence in writing tests, and it's kind of taken a lot of the pain away from it. So now that that's kind of like, it's almost become second nature to me at this point. And I figured it would be nice to kind of share what kind of tips I tend to follow, like what those guiding principles are that help me to find it a little bit less painful. So I'm going to talk about how I approach unit testing, specifically for React components, mainly with React Testing Library and Jest, and particularly kind of following the principle of our tests being close to how the user would experience our product. And I'm hoping that I can give you just some ideas about like how you can get a better understanding of how to write good unit tests, how to make writing them a bit easier, how to make them a bit more effective, and hopefully a couple of tips to help you make better decisions, or at least have some kind of food for thought that you can kind of consider next time you are making decisions around testing. And a couple of tips as well on how to avoid flakiness, which is a topic that has been on my mind so much lately. I like to see people who know the pain. So I figure any good tech talk needs to have an example app that I invested way too much time into. So I came up with, it's not the most original idea, so I don't know why I phrase it that way, but this app that is very simple. It just sort of has a title, an amazing title, which is, I think I called it an amazing cat pic generator. It has the date on it. It has a button. You click the button. We hook up to the Unsplash API, fetch a random picture of a cat, show it on the screen. So I had a lot of fun with this, mainly because I just got to look at cat pictures for honestly more hours than I'd like to admit. As part of this app, we've obviously got error states. I figured there's going to be a little bit of error handling so that, you know, if something goes wrong making a network request or fetching those pictures, we show an error. And I've got kind of an edge case as well, which is where, for example, you press the button the first time, you get a picture of a cat. Maybe the second time you try and press the button and get another cat picture, maybe your network connection fails, maybe something goes wrong. And we still show you the picture that you saw before, but we also show you that error state. So this is, when I give a couple of examples, this is kind of going to be the example app that I'm thinking about, and we're going to think a little bit about how we might test this. Before we dive in, I kind of wanted to give a little bit of a caveat. I am focusing on React Testing Library, and I'm focusing a little bit on Jest as well, mainly because that's where my experience has been most recently, but also because I think those are really good, genuinely really good tools for like testing your components in a way that is similar to how a user would experience them. I recognize not everyone might be using these, but hopefully people can still come away with like some high level ideas that can be applicable to whatever you are using for your tests. And if not, maybe you'll just learn something about React Testing Library that you didn't know. And it is worth bearing in mind that I'm going to be telling you about things that I personally find helpful. There are always other ways of doing things. There are always other options. And as kind of with everything, there are probably areas where you might want to make compromises. So, if I'm saying, oh, this is an excellent way to write your test and you're going to get the best coverage, you might argue, yeah, that's great, but actually my tests are going to be really slow. So it's just kind of worth bearing in mind that there are going to be compromises to be made. And, I'm not sort of dictating to you how you should do things, but hopefully giving you some things you can think about. And then, when you apply it to your environment, to the kind of setup that you have, the environment you're working in, like the company you work for, the app you're building, you can kind of just think, does this apply here? Does this feel right? Does this match with our priorities? So let's dive in. My first piece of advice is to just write really clear test descriptions. So for me, I always feel like my tests can act as a good source of documentation. So I try and write my tests to describe kind of exactly how my components should act, exactly what the expected behavior should be, exactly what kind of flows we're expecting. And that way, even if my component ends up, maybe my component code isn't the most readable, maybe it's very complicated, maybe over time it's had more and more functionality built on top of it, and it can be quite hard for somebody new to the code base to dig into it. Regardless of whatever your component looks like, other developers should be able to come to your tests, give them a read, see, oh, I understand how this component is supposed to work now, I understand the flows. So that's one reason I really like to have some really clear descriptions. I also try and make them kind of focused around the user a little bit. So rather than kind of making these tests sound really technical, talking about kind of rendering and state, I try and talk about what does this actually mean for the user? What are we actually testing here? What is the state for? What are we displaying? What are we rendering? So I've got some examples that I don't love when I come across them, which are when we're sort of saying, I think this one comes in create React app, renders correctly or renders without crashing. And yeah, it's not very descriptive. What does it mean for this component to render correctly? I don't know. And, other tests that say sort of handles a click, calls a function. Again, that doesn't really tell us what I'm trying to adjust this mic so I can't hear my heavy breathing. Oh, it got worse. Regret. Yeah, we don't know what this button is doing. This isn't very descriptive. We're just talking about implementation here. So a better way that I might rewrite this test is I might talk about, for my cat app, instead of renders correctly, I'm going to say we're displaying a heading and a date. I might also say it displays that sort of placeholder image section you might have seen before anyone's clicked a button. And rather than talking about handling a click, I'm going to talk about when the user clicks, give me a new cat picture, we're going to fetch and display a picture of a cat. So you can already see this is telling us a lot more about, even if you've forgotten about the cat app, hopefully this gives you some idea of what that looks like. Whereas the example on the left, it could be anything. Second tip is around what exactly I think it's good to cover in your tests. So I think it goes without saying, we want to cover what the user is going to experience, what should happen in your component, the happy path. But that's not all. We want to test these default states, we want to test what should happen, but we also want to test the error states, maybe the loading states, the edge cases, anything that could happen, even if you're thinking, oh, it probably doesn't happen often, it might be worth thinking about whether it's still worth testing. For example, in the app I've mentioned, we're going to test that happy path of showing a cat picture when you click the button, but we're also going to test this error state as well, so that we can make sure that when when there is an error, when we're trying to fetch a cat picture, that's being handled, that our app doesn't just fully fall apart and crash. And we can test that we're showing something useful to the user as well. And I would also test this sort of edge casey scenario, which it can be a little bit more awkward to test and a little bit more awkward to explain. But to test this kind of weird edge cases like, oh, we've already got a cat picture, but we're trying to fetch another one. It doesn't quite work. Might as well keep the cat picture there, test that still appears correctly, and test that the error state shows up. One of the things I wanted to highlight, this is quite specific to React testing library, is that you can sometimes get accessibility testing for free. React testing library has this great set of selectors that you can use to kind of investigate what elements are showing in the document. So, for example, there's this get by role selector, which you can use to find elements based on their accessible roles. So things like buttons, inputs, form fields, checkboxes, links, all those kind of accessible elements that you might be using. And if you use something like get by role, you can basically not only look for your like elements appearing in your document, but you can check they have the correct like sort of semantic accessible names. So that's a really handy thing for me that I use quite a lot, because it's handy to see, oh yeah, I've got my basic accessibility baked in. Similarly, you can use, got up here, get by alt text. So if you're searching for an image, you can find that image using the alt text, and you're not only checking that your image is there, but you're also checking it has some alt text, which is something that you always want to aim for, so your images have text rather than just like having the image presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about mocking. I don't want to go too deep into it because there's actually a really great talk all about mocking and using jest. I think it was the last React Girls meetup by Millicent Bath, and I think that's a really great resource to learn more about mocking. But I want to talk a little bit on how to make decisions about when mocking is relevant to your tests. These are a few examples of times that I think it's a good idea to use mocks. I think the only sort of non-negotiable one of these is network calls. If you're testing a component that makes a network call, please always mock that network call, because you don't want to make real network calls in tests. If I'm hitting the Unsplash API every time I run my tests, they're going to actually block me, which isn't great. At the same time, or maybe even more importantly, my unit tests are going to be reliant on somebody else's API, and that's not really my unit. That's going beyond my unit. We can end up with slower tests. We can end up with timeout issues. Something I've seen a lot recently. Nish knows about it at the back. And you can end up with like just a noisy errors in your console as well from all your sort of failed network, like attempted network connections when you're attempting to connect to a server that you don't have access to. So yeah, this is something I've seen like flaky tests appear from. So that's the only one of these I'd say is non-negotiable. I can't really think of any reason you'd want to make network calls in your unit tests. But a couple of other situations where you might want to use mocks are if you've got very complex child components being rendered, things that really make it very difficult to test what you're working on without going way down a rabbit hole, or very well-tested shared functions that you've got, whether those are from your own code base or whether you're importing them from some kind of external library, like something like React Router. It can be handy to mock out the routing-related functions there so you're not inadvertently testing the whole routing functionality that's implemented by a third party. But it's also important to consider when we don't want to use mocks, because the more mocking you do in your test, even though it might feel like it makes your life a little bit easier, they might even run a little bit faster, it's taking us further away from reality, and that's taking value away from your test. It's basically taking away testing. So what I like to think about when I'm considering mocking something in a test is just, am I doing this just to make my life that little bit easier? Or is there actually a much better reason for it? And what is the cost of not the cost of not mocking? What is the cost of mocking this component or this function? What might I miss? What bugs might come up that I would just have no idea of because I've mocked it? I really want to talk about one of the biggest things that has tripped me up, like just time and time again, and actually has been really relevant to me recently, which is the subject of flaky tests, which is one of those things that's just always kind of been a thing I've had a little bit of dread about. Like when I've sort of seen our pipelines looking a bit dodgy, when I've seen, oh, this random test has failed on my PR, I always kind of tended to be the person that just went, oh, I don't know what that is. That seems totally unrelated. I'm just going to hit rerun quietly and kind of sneak back away into my corner and pretend I didn't see it. Maybe because they're difficult to debug. And there are basically a lot of reasons you might have flaky tests. But I want to talk about one that I've come across a lot recently, and I think is also probably one of the hardest ones to debug, which is when you have flaky tests because there's some kind of, I don't know if this is the technical term, but like leakiness in your test. And what I mean by that is that when your tests aren't like fully independent of one another, when, something happening in one test has a knock-on effect to your next test, which has a knock-on effect to your other ones. And then suddenly you can end up with, one test failing randomly, and you look at the test file and you think everything looks great here, but it's something weird that happened like 3 tests ago in a totally different test file. And you could have to go through every single test file in your code base to try to figure out which one that is. So the reasons you can end up with this issue where your tests are kind of leaking into each other and affecting one another, it could be, you could have things like your component state being changed in one test, and, maybe it's not being reset in some way, or it's, it's persisting into your other tests. It could be maybe you're using Redux, and if you set up the state maybe only once, then all of your tests might be using the same state. You change the state in one test, the other one goes to use it. That state's not looking how you expect it to be because it's been changed by a different test. Or maybe you're using some mocks in your test file and you're not resetting them. And then in the later, you're changing the value of those mocks at one point, going into another test, expecting them to do something totally different. But they're all having this sort of knock-on effect on each other. This is one of the sites that greeted me the other day when I was trying to deploy. Nobody loves to see this many failed pipelines when you're trying to release. So I wanted to give a bit of an example of like what that actually looks like and what that might mean. This is kind of an example where we're setting up a mock at the start of our tests, and we're rendering a component at the start of the test. Now we might have like 10 tests in this file. They're all at this point using the same component. They're using the same mock. So any changes we make in any of those earlier tests, those are going to basically be passed down and persist to the later tests, which can end you up in that situation where your tests just aren't independent of each other. They're all having an impact on each other. And you'll end up getting different results when you run your test on its own versus when you run it as part of the whole suite. Like maybe then it starts failing and you're kind of like, damn it, why can't it just work the same as it worked on its own? So here's how you might make it a little bit better. So in this situation, we've got kind of a before each block where we're setting up our mocks, and after each test runs, we're resetting them. This means that like the kind of tally of the number of times that this mock has been called is reset each time. We're basically just starting from a fresh slate rather than having a situation where our tests impact one another. And then this is where we're actually going to use those mocks that we've set up and kind of change the value of them each time. So I've got a test here where I want to check that when I click my button and I make a successful network call, I get a cat picture. So we're setting up our mock to have a success value, whatever that looks like, whatever that object is. We're clicking our button, we're looking for the image, and we're checking that the helper function that makes that network call has been called once. Then in our second test, I'm going to set up that mock a little bit differently. So in our second test, I want to check that if the API returns a network error, the app doesn't crash. We show a nice error in the UI. And so in this one, we set up the mocks with a different value. And then again, we can sort of click the button. Our mocks have still been called once. And this is my final tip, which seems really straightforward, but it's not always, which is just to make sure your tests fail, because a test that doesn't fail isn't particularly useful. We want to know when there's a bug in our code. Like that's the reason our tests are there at the end of the day. It's to catch something so that we don't have to be looking for it. But if your test never fails, it's not doing that job at all. And it's almost worse to have that test that doesn't ever fail than to have no test at all, because you'll be thinking, oh, I'm sure it's fine. I've got that test. Everything looks great. That test's lying to you. So I usually check this just by intentionally going back into my code while I'm writing my tests and just introducing a little bug for myself, like inverting a conditional statement so it does the opposite of what it should do by hiding an element that's really key to my UI, or just like flipping around some logic and then checking if my test still passes. And I mean, there are a lot of times when I've done this and my test does still pass. And at that point, you go back, debug, have a look at what could have gone wrong here. I realized we've got part of my next bit of code up there. I was wondering what that was. because I fixed a typo about 5 minutes ago. So in this example, we're looking to check that some text doesn't appear in the document, but I've made a typo in that text that I'm looking for. So that test is always going to pass. There's no situation on Earth where we get this sort of typo error appearing in my text, in my UI. And we've got another test here where we're checking that no error state is present, but maybe we've not waited for our network call to even finish. So how would we get an error state? We're still in a loading state. And I see this one done a lot because it's quite an easy thing to forget, and it will pass because, you know, the test will say, yeah, there's no error state here, but there is a loading state. So just to recap what I've kind of talked about, we want to write clear unit tests that can help out future developers who are reading your code. We want to cover not just the happy paths, but the unhappy paths, the error paths, the edge cases. We want to use appropriate selectors and get accessibility baked in for free. Always consider, do I actually want to mock this functionality? Is that useful to me? Or am I just making my life a little bit easier and actually taking away from the value of my test? I want to keep tests independent of each other so they're not influencing each other and causing unpredictable, flaky failures. And just make sure those tests fail, like I was just saying. That is all. I've just got a couple of references in here for things that I mentioned. So quite Googleable is Millicent's talk if anyone wanted to look into more information about mocking. And there are some really great blog posts by Kent C. Dodds about React testing library and just how to use it most effectively. So I thought I'd share those. But yeah, thank you everybody for listening.